Good evening, and welcome back to our continuing series on the morning blessings. As discussed in past weeks, the morning blessings are designed to acknowledge the things that happen to us every day, not to take them for granted. Not just life in general, that we're alive every morning, refreshed and vital, but we have all the functions necessary to be able to fulfill our mission in this world. Of course, just being alive, having our health, is enough to be grateful to God, to express that gratitude on a daily basis. But Judaism is not just about living, it's about living with a higher purpose. And as such, when we read the blessings and we have questions about why this blessing is phrased this way, why we're focusing on this and maybe neglecting or denigrating something else it may seem, we have to look at it through the lens of what is our purpose in this world and how what we wake up in the morning, what talents we have, and what energies we have, how that helps. It began with night. The first thing we do in the morning is we wake up, we hear our alarm clock alerting us to the fact that a new day has begun. So the first thing we have to know is we have yesterday, that's yesterday, we'll deal with it, but we have to now focus on what we can do today, because every day has its own life, its own soul. The last three blessings, and the one we're going to do today is the last of those three. And of course that raises questions and people are all upset about it. It's discriminatory that we're putting down women, and this is what this class is going to be about, to show how, number one, it's not about putting down women at all. In fact, in the opposite way. But remember, we're not here in the context about what I have that I'm grateful for that is not in the context of why I am here in this world. So we already explained that when we say the blessing, thanking God for not having made me a every human being was created in God's image, we're saying that we are grateful to God that He has not diminished our ability to serve Him, because all human beings have 7 basic commandments. The Jewish people at Mount Sinai were given 613. So we're grateful. So where do you find people thanking anyone for giving them more responsibilities? You're an employee in a business, and your employer starts piling on more and more responsibilities. Well, that's what makes Judaism unique, because every mitzvah, commandment that we do, but the secondary meaning is a bond. Every mitzvah we do creates a bond between us and God, and we thank God for giving us so many different opportunities that had we been created not to be Jewish, we would have been denied those opportunities unless we decided to convert, in which case, I already explained, and I'll explain it again when we get to the final blessing. Then we thank God for not having made me a slave. Now, most people would think, well, everyone could relate to that. Thank God we're free. But that's not what the blessing is about primarily. Maybe secondarily, you could read more meaning into it, as we have done in the past. But the basic reason, as the Talmud explains, the Tosefta, that's an addendum to the Talmud, that we are thanking God because, and as later commentaries explain it, we are free because in Jewish law, in the olden days when they had slavery, a slave that was purchased by a Jew had to accept upon himself the responsibilities to fulfill most of the commandments, but not all of them. He's exempted from many of the commandments. Therefore, we're grateful to God that He has not made us a slave, thereby exempting us from different commandments. We're grateful we have more commandments than even the slave who is partially Jewish. And then we go to the third blessing and the final one, because in Judaism, every person has responsibilities that are very much specific to this individual within the context and the framework of all of our mitzvahs. Generally speaking, Judaism is divided into different classes, just like a military, to use an analogy. that we have officers, you have infantry, you have intelligence, and special forces, and so on and so forth. And within each of these, you have different divisions. We, too, also have a Kohen, who's what we translate as a priest, the Levi, the Israel, the Israelite. Then we have men, and we have women, we have children, we have adults, we have senior citizens, we have many different classes. We have teachers, we have students, we have rabbis, we have congregants, we have leaders, and we have followers. And we have vendors, and we have consumers, we have doctors, and we have patients. Every class of humanity is given special responsibilities that that class has that another class does not have. For example, if you are a doctor, you have responsibilities towards your patients. That's not the same responsibility that a patient has to the doctor, obviously. Everyone has to know his or her unique responsibilities. If you come as a guest to someone's home, the host has responsibility to the guest. The guest has responsibility how to treat the host. At any rate, I think the message is quite clear that every group, every class has its own special responsibilities, and each person should be focusing on his or her own and acknowledging that that responsibility that is unique to you is unique, and you have to be grateful for it. So we have different responsibilities for men, different responsibilities for women. Women in general are obligated to fulfill the majority of the 613 commandments. There are about a dozen which they are exempted from, and only about 2 that they are encouraged not to do. Putting on a talit, prayer shawl, and wearing tefillin. And that, when we have time, I'll explain it later. Otherwise, I just wanted to emphasize, contrary to the myth, and I've heard this myth spread by people who should have known better, rabbis, that men have 613 commandments, women have 3. And there's absolutely not even a kernel of truth in that statement. Men have 613 if you count all the commandments, even the ones that we can't fulfill today because we don't have the temple. But in the total amount, there's 613. Women have about 600, give or take 1 or 2. And of those 6 dozen or so that they are exempted from, they are allowed to do it, and they are encouraged to do it, and most of them do perform those, except for 2, as I said before. So there's almost no difference, but there is a slight difference that men do have more responsibilities, more, even though it's a few, they have more. The only truth to the idea of 3 mitzvahs that women have is that there are 3 areas of Jewish practice that apply to men and to women, that women have a special role within those 3, and that special role is indicative of the uniqueness of the Jewish woman, and that we'll talk about later. But meanwhile, I think it's important that we establish the ground rules, that we're not talking about putting down women, that women are inferior to men, women are lowly, but that we are grateful that we are not denied certain mitzvahs that we can do that bring us closer to God. That is the basic understanding of this bracha. Now, I have to acknowledge that there have been many attempts, especially in modern times, to eliminate that blessing. But if you eliminate that blessing, you'd have to say that the rabbis who devised this blessing, specifically Rabbi Meir, one of the greatest Talmudic sages, student of Rabbi Akiva, and one of the greatest in his own right, that he was in error, and 2,000 years of Jewish practice, and it probably predated Rabbi Meir, so 2,000 plus years of Jewish practice can be thrown out the door, thrown out the window, and then it raises a question, then why are we even following any of the teachings of these rabbis if we believe that they are man-made, not just human-made, but man-made, and they are discriminatory, and we can find fault with everything, and if everyone is allowed to find fault with these teachings, then we could throw the whole thing out. But the truth of the matter is that these rabbis did not compose things based on a whim, based on a personal grudge, based on a philosophical leaning. They are based on God's inspiration. These are people who spoke and wrote and taught with divine inspiration. And these blessings are so measured that every word, every letter is so precise, and each word conveys spiritual energy. And when we say it, it energizes us. So we just have to say to ourselves, if we don't understand the meaning of a certain prayer, I am willing to listen to the explanation, and And I'm willing to surrender my own limited understanding to that of someone who is so much greater than ourselves. So we are going to continue to the end of time, perhaps, to recite this blessing. Perhaps in the Messianic age, there could be some slight variations to certain blessings based on the changing of conditions. But this blessing, the way it is holy and sacrosanct, and we're not going to change it. I mentioned this in an earlier class when Jews were subjected, rabbis, to debates with Christian clergy, and they had to defend many of the things the Talmud writes that they claimed were anti-Gentile, anti-Christian. They brought up the blessing, thanking God that hasn't made me a non-Jew. And they argued that obviously that's discriminatory against non-Jews. What did the rabbis answer? They said, we also say a blessing that God has not made me a woman. Do we hate our wives? Do we hate our sisters? Do we hate our daughters? Do we hate our mothers? Do we hate our grandmothers and aunts and all the other close relatives? If you look at the Talmud and you read what it says, how one is supposed to treat his wife, you're supposed to love her as yourself and honor her even more than you honor yourself. Honoring means providing for the best things in life. To show appreciation, you have to give her more than what you would give yourself and love her as you would yourself. There's absolutely no trace of evidence that there's anything negative towards women. Yes, the Talmud does say some negative things about women, but it says an equal amount of negative things about men and an equal amount of positive things about women and positive things about men, because men and women are not perfect. As we often say, that we're human, which means that we have our challenges, and men and women do have different challenges. And I don't care what modern society says, men and women are different, not just biologically, but also spiritually, and maybe other layers in between the spiritual and the biological. And each person has to focus on his or her strengths and meet the challenges that are germane and relevant to this individual as an individual. So having said that, it's clear that this blessing is not intended to put down women. So let's go into this a little bit more in depth. Women have fewer mitzvahs than men, but it's so much fewer because it's only about a dozen. And even those dozen, women are encouraged to fulfill. But there's a difference, and that's why we note this difference. Men are obligated to fulfill them. For women, it's optional. For women, it's like volunteering for something. Aha. Then you'd argue that on the contrary, women should be given more credit because they fulfill the commandments that they're not obligated to fulfill. They volunteer. They do it voluntarily. Isn't that superior to the man who's compelled to do it? And that actually is a interesting discussion of the Talmud, not even in relation to men and women, but in relation to people who might have fewer obligations. There was a rabbi whose name was Yosef, Rav Yosef, one of the great Talmudic sages who unfortunately was blind. And he said that he would throw a party for anyone who would tell him that a blind person is exempted from the commandments because of the disability. They can't be held accountable for the commandments. He said if that was true, if that anyone could determine that that was the law, he will throw a party for that person. Why? Because even though I'm exempted, I still do them. And I deserve more credit because it means more to do something voluntarily than to be compelled to do it. Then, he said, he heard that, no, on the contrary, the one who was commanded to do something is greater, superior to the one who does it voluntarily. He says, when I heard that, I said I'd throw a party for anyone who tells me that being blind doesn't exempt you from any commandments. You're still as much obligated as you were if you had been able to see. Because now I know that being obligated is superior to doing things voluntarily, which of course begs the obvious question. Isn't it something that you put your own will into? You know, if you give charity willingly, isn't it superior to someone who was forced into giving, who's embarrassed into giving, or from whom the authorities confiscate his property to give to the poor? And the answer is yes and no. There's an advantage to doing things voluntarily, but there's also a greater advantage to doing things when you have a commandment. And the reason is as follows. As I said before, well, I'll give you two reasons. One reason is that when a person has an obligation to do something, he has an equal amount of pressure that is mounting to get him or her not to do it. That means if I have an obligation to do something, because it's so important for me to do, the fact that it's important is evidence from the fact that I was commanded to do it. If God didn't think it was so important, he wouldn't command me to do it. God creates an opposite pressure, a force, a counterforce to give me a challenge, to make me sweat in order to achieve the fulfillment of that commandment. We tell a story of a great chassid, a man who devoted his entire Thursday night, as is the custom in many places, to study Torah all night long. He wouldn't sleep Thursday night, and Friday he was refreshed. He never had a problem. He did this for many decades. And then one time, his Rebbe, his Hasidic master, told him that he should spend Thursday nights in the study of Torah and not go to sleep. But he did this for decades. But now that he was told to do it, he said he felt so tired he could hardly stay awake. And he recognized that when he did it voluntarily, he did it without obstacles. When he had no choice, he was commanded to do it because he respected his Rebbe, his master, and he wouldn't dare violate anything he told him to do. Then he found a tremendous amount of resistance. So the man who is obligated to do these mitzvahs that a woman is exempted from but does anyhow has an advantage because he has the pressure, the resistance that he has to overcome. There's another reason why being commanded is considered to be superior to doing it voluntarily, because as I mentioned before, the word mitzvah means commandment, but it also means bond. When you are commanded to do something, that is God's way of binding to you, just like in a marriage. How do you get married? You make a commitment. You're binding yourself to your spouse, saying, I am going to support you. I am going to provide you with all your needs. And it's a mutual thing in a marriage. And that binding through the responsibilities and commitments is what cements the relationship between the husband and wife. Similarly, God as the husband and we as the wife, God binds himself to us and we to him through the commandments, the obligations that we have. So when a woman does a mitzvah, yes, that creates some type of a relationship with God. She's doing something for him. God appreciates it. She gets reward for it. But it doesn't have the same cement, the same crazy glue that the mitzvah that you do, that you are obligated to do. That's why the women's obligations, as great as they are, the ones that, the mitzvahs that she does that she's not obligated, about a dozen, for example, I'm sure some people are thinking, what examples are there of obligations that women, mitzvahs that women don't have, but they do anyhow? First of all, hearing the shofar in Rosh Hashanah. Women are technically exempt, but many women do make a point of hearing the shofar. On the holiday of Sukkot, we take the four kinds, the four species, we make a blessing, and we wave it. Women are not obligated to do that, but they do it anyhow. And between Passover and Shavuos, the two holidays, we're supposed to count each day. It's a time-related commandment. Women are exempted from. Women are encouraged to do it. Reading the Shema every day, morning and night, is not an obligation for women, but they have a great desire to do it, and many of them do say the Shema every day. Women are not obligated to study Torah the way men are, but they are nevertheless given credit when they study Torah. Although women do have an obligation to study the parts of Torah that relate to their obligation, so they should know how to practice whatever mitzvahs they do have. But be that as it may, and I didn't exhaust the whole list, women are encouraged to do it, but they don't have the same degree of bonding as a man has. That's why we're saying, thank you, you haven't diminished our ability to bind with you, and therefore we're grateful for that. Some say that this blessing also contains another nuance, although that's not the original reason given. It's an additional thing. When Chava, when Eve partook of the forbidden fruit, And as a result, God said that would bring death to the world. It also brought travail in childbirth, pregnancy, labor, childbirth, and the raising of a little baby, something that is the province of the woman, and that is something that entails a tremendous amount of pain and travail. So the man is saying, thank God you haven't given me the same pain and suffering that a woman has, and therefore I'm grateful for that. Some take it a step further, and they say that a woman has no respite from responsibility. And we're generalizing, of course. I can only talk from my own experience. I can talk about my mother. I can talk about my wife. I can talk about my sisters. I can talk about daughters. But I can also talk about many others whose sense of responsibility is 24/7. The man may have a hard job. He may work overtime. But he always has a time when he is finished with his work. We don't praise workaholics. We praise men who do see the clock and it says time for work is over. Now a more important thing happens. You go home and you have a relationship with your family. But a man knows that his work is over. He could compartmentalize. He does work in the office this part of the day. He comes home. He could relax. A woman's job, as the saying goes, is never over. And that is very much true. And even though a woman could also take a vacation and work a certain number of hours, there's a certain feminine drive that a woman has that she always has to be doing something. I can only talk about my mother. My mother was always busy. She would always be singing, always a joyous melody. Whenever she was doing the dishes or cooking or cleaning or organizing the home, she did it with such joy and satisfaction, knowing that she is fulfilling her purpose. I don't even think it was something that she had to meditate on. It was so natural. And I know my mother was unique, but nevertheless, I think that's a model for many of the women. So in a sense, a man couldn't handle that. A man has to have boundaries, and he's grateful. Thank God you haven't made me a woman, because if I had to handle working all the time and never having boundaries, I would never be able to survive. Question has been asked, not just about this blessing, but the other two as well. Why is it in the negative? And I gave a few answers in the last few weeks. And the basic answer is that when you wake up in the morning, you cannot say, God, you have made me a free male Jew with all of the benefits, because you haven't proved yourself. You haven't demonstrated that it's worthwhile being human, worthwhile being a Jew, worthwhile being a male with all the additional obligations, because you were just asleep a few minutes ago. We haven't done anything yet. You only could say, thank you, God, that you haven't taken away my potential to do certain things if I choose, and I hope I will choose to do them. You haven't made me a woman with fewer obligations. In that way, I wouldn't be able to fulfill my responsibilities the way I really feel I want to. Let's go a little bit deeper into this. I'm trying to understand the woman's role in Judaism. And when we understand that, we'll see that this blessing is not a discriminatory one, where we're putting down women. We're actually putting women on a pedestal in a very strange way. And most people will say, yeah, come on, that's not what the blessing says. It says, Shelo asani isha, have not made me a woman. But you have to understand that the Talmudic rabbis were very, very careful in couching things very subtly. And sometimes what may seem to be a real creative way of putting things, and not the simple meaning, was the simple meaning of what they said. So let me explain it this way. I have an analogy that I think is helpful. You have this company. The company has many employees. Many of its employees are salespeople. Their job is to travel with the wares from city to city and sell the merchandise. Then you have managerial positions. You have someone who's in charge of the plant where they manufacture all of the merchandise, which is then given to the salespeople. Now, the salesperson is contracted to run up, and they tell him what his salary is going to be, what his commission is going to be. And then they say, here is so much for the car. You need a car. And they give him a car, or they give him the expenses of the car. Now they negotiate the contract with the manager. And the manager gets whatever the manager gets. And the manager says, 1 second, this is not fair. Am I not the manager? Yes. Is my job not superior one to the salesperson? Absolutely. You're in charge of the whole plant, in charge of the salespeople. So then why am I not getting a car? And the answer is, you live near the plant. You don't have to go traveling from city to city. You don't need the car to be able to do your work. But the salesperson couldn't possibly succeed in doing his work without the means for transportation, without that car. That analogy, I think, is suitable here. The man's obligation is to go out into the outside world, leave the confines of the Jewish home, and struggle with all of the negative influences that exist in the world, trying to defeat the things in the world that retard and inhibit our progress. The man is out there slaying the dragons, as it were. The man is out there in a very hostile environment. Because let's take every environment outside of the synagogue, outside of the Jewish home, outside of the Jewish house of study. There's always hostility. There's always negativity. You're in business, you're struggling, you're competing with your, it becomes an adversarial relationship. You're competing with your fellow workers. You're at odds with your boss or with your employees. That is in the nicest of situations. And then you can get into all sorts of very major conflicts out in the outside world. But that's the role of the man. The role of the woman is to create a home, to create a nurturing, spiritual environment. We're not talking about four walls and a roof of a house. We're talking about turning, as the cliche goes, a house into a home, transforming it into a place that God would feel comfortable entering into, just like you would tidy up your house if you knew an important dignitary was going to come. That's how you tidy the house in terms of its moral and its spiritual nature. And then God says, I feel comfortable in this home. Who creates that environment? Who brings in the warmth? Who brings in the love? Who brings in the purity and the holiness? That is the woman. That is the mother. That is the wife. That is the sister. That is their role, to create a dwelling for God in a micro form. And in the aggregate, when enough people create enough micro dwellings for God, we create the macro dwelling. The world becomes God's domicile, God's place of habitation, and that is the Messianic age. And that's what we're working towards, to create a world that is a godly world. In a minor way, a minor that is major, every home run by the woman is that type of a institution, a dwelling for God. So here the woman is fulfilling her purpose of creation in the most direct way. If the purpose of creation is to create a dwelling for God in this world, women do that literally, not just figuratively. They are creating a physical structure, a home in which God feels comfortable because of what they do, the way they exude this warmth and this love and this light and this holiness and purity. They create a dwelling for God. Men also create a dwelling, but in an indirect way. Every time a man puts on tefillin and binds himself to God, going against his nature, putting it on the head and on the arm near the heart, the weaker arm, as if to say, I have to bind my weaker side, my animal side. I have to transform my emotions, control them with my intellect. That's one of the messages of tefillin. Man also generates divine energy into the world, but it's not contained within a structure the way a woman who actually does it within a home, within a confined area and environment. So men's mitzvahs generally relate to conquering the outside world. Putting on tefillin is a prime example because it demonstrates how you're taking the weaker side of your personality and by extension, you're taking the weaker side of society, and you're bringing morality. You're in a business, you bring ethics and morality and integrity to that business. You're in a relationship with different people, you do it with respect, dignity, and integrity, and likewise everything else that goes along with all the responsibilities that a man has. It's either directly related to his work in dealing and engaging the world, or it's related to what he does in the synagogue. What is the reason a man goes to a synagogue? That is a male institution, because the man is outside. He's in a world of chaos, a world of conflict, and he has to find a refuge. It's like the cities of refuge. It's a place for him to go where he could avoid the interaction with the outside world to regain some of his spiritual energy, and he wraps himself in a talus that protects him. He puts on the tefillin that binds him and controls him, and prays in a way, in a structured way, to try to develop this love for Hashem, for God, so he can go out into the world and bring some of that love there, and at least tame the world somewhat. So a man gets up in the morning and he says, "Thank you, God, that you haven't made me a woman, that you haven't denied me that car. I'm a salesperson. My job is to go out into the world. If you had made me a woman without that, without those commandments, without that metaphoric car to get around, to be able to fulfill my mission, I would be stuck. I would be lost. A woman doesn't need that car. A woman doesn't need those commandments that a man needs to interact with the world or to protect himself from the negative influences." And that's why the man says, "Thank you, haven't made me a woman." Because a woman is superior in that regard to the man, that she has a direct connection to God's plan and purpose, and she doesn't need the additional commandments to keep her straight and to make sure that she is in line with what God had in mind for her. More specifically, a woman has certain mitzvahs, certain commandments that a man is also responsible for, but a woman has a special role. Those are the 3 commandments that are represented by the woman's name, Hannah. Hannah was the mother of the prophet Samuel, who anointed King David, the progenitor of the Davidic dynasty, leading up to Mashiach. So she has a special role with making the world a complete world. She paved the way. And what does the word Hannah, the name Hannah, symbolize? It's an acronym for 3 of the mitzvahs that women have a special role in. One of them is challah. She bakes the bread for the Shabbos, and she separates a piece of dough and burns it. In the olden days, they would give it to the Kohen, to the priest. It symbolizes making your food holy. That's a woman's role. She can bring holiness into the home. Then Nun stands for Nida, the laws of family purity. The woman, at the end of her period, after counting 7 days, goes to the mikveh, immerses herself, brings spiritual purity. Not that she's impure, but she is in a state of respite, a state of pause and separation and renewal when she goes to the mikveh, and she brings the spirit of purity into the home that only a woman could do. And then the hay is Hadlakas Haner, lighting of the candles Friday night and every holiday before sunset, of course. On Shabbos, we light it before sunset as a way of bringing light into the home. When a woman focuses and accentuates these 3 commandments, it highlights what her role is that she has that we don't have as men. But men are grateful that they were given as a compensation, as a consolation prize, if you will, that they have other additional responsibilities that help them cope with their special role. I'd like to share a new insight in this blessing. Male and female, masculine and feminine, are representative of 2 different directions. A male spiritual energy is the energy of the mashpia, the one who gives, the one who's constantly projecting and giving. The feminine is on the receiving end, is the one who's receptive. And the man has both male and female, the woman has both male and female. But the emphasis of the male is projecting, spreading out his influence and energy. The woman is internalizing whatever energy there is, internalizing it, nurturing it, making it integrated within your system. these two talents are very important. You need both talents. You can't just be a giver. You have the sun, you have the moon. You can't just be a sun where you just give off light. You have to be a moon. You have to be able to be receptive. But being receptive alone is not enough. You have to be capable of giving, of bestowing, of influencing, inspiring. But again, men are most likely associated with the sun. Women are most likely associated with the moon. Actually, the moon has its cycles, renewal every month, the same way women's biology functions in a lunar cycle. Men's system is more likened to the sun. Okay, so we have both the sun and the moon. What would happen if a man would develop this receptivity and would be as acute or as developed, as well developed as a woman's ability to be receptive? That would be destructive for the man. Because the man who's outside in the negative world, in the hostile world, is immune and impervious to those influences only because he's involved in giving the world, in struggling with it and fighting it, and being proactive in negating the negative influences. But if the man would have this feminine quality of receptivity, he doesn't have the device, the filter, to filter out the negative influences and only be absorbing the positive influences, because the male doesn't have that filter. So thank God that you've made me a man with my sun-like function of giving, and you've reduced my receptivity. Sometimes our wives complain about us that we're not listening to them, we're not receptive, we're not hearing what they have to say. But thank God we don't have that great talent of receptivity, because if we would have it and we're dealing with the outside world, we would be so badly influenced, and we're influenced badly enough as it is, that we would be destroying ourselves. The woman, on the other hand, has a spiritual filter. This is how Kabbalah explains the creation of woman, that she is designed to have this ability to be receptive, but also to be able to filter out the negative. The Talmud says that men are more hospitable than women by nature. What does that mean? It doesn't mean that women are not compassionate and giving. On the contrary, they're more compassionate. But when some outside influence comes into your home, when Abraham brought in the guests, he didn't care who it was. He didn't care if it was a bad influence for his kids. Abraham had the masculine. Bring in as many people. Give as much as you can. Sarah had this filter. She said, yes, I'm receptive. I like guests, but I will be discriminatory. I will make sure that only positive influences come into the home. So when the man says the blessing, you haven't made me a woman, he doesn't mean that women are inferior. He means that I don't have the talent that women have, in receptivity, and yet being in a masculine world, having to absorb all those negative energies. The women say a blessing. In the Talmud, there is no mention of any blessing that women say, but there is a blessing that was composed much later, and in many communities it is said by women. But we'll have to leave that for next week. So God willing, tune in again next week, and we'll discuss the women's blessing, and we'll delve a little bit more deeply into the mystical definition of masculinity and femininity. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again next week, God willing.